Hey guys, Jathan here with another video. I say that fully realizing it's been almost 2 years since my 3-2-1 backups and intro to Kopia video. But a couple of things. So first and foremost, in the spirit of honesty, making videos before was kind of a pain. I had a Mac Mini, have a Mac Mini still. That is kind of my daily driver when I'm not working. So, I have my work laptop. I have a personal computer I keep next to me to keep tabs on my personal notes, whatever it may be. Um, every time I had to go to make a video, I felt like I had to scrub everything. I had to check my desktop for any file names that were, revealing in any way in terms of like personal information. I had to clean up my browser tabs. I had to check my bookmarks bar and see if I drug anything there on accident. Same thing that was revealing or anything like that. I've since gotten a dedicated machine to record from, so hopefully that problem has gone away. Additionally, the first follow-up I really wanted to make was basically backing up using Kopia to an S3 or S3 compatible bucket. And then by using bucket versioning or object locking, you should be able to essentially give yourself some level of ransomware protection. To restore from that, though, Kopia had to introduce some functionality to basically actually do a point-in-time restore. And that was in a feature branch at the time, but it took forever for them to actually approve that and merge it into their main branch. So it's been in a release now for, I think, a couple of months. I've played with it enough that I feel comfortable to actually make some content around it. And ultimately, not a great excuse, but here I am 2 years later, back with the video that I promised. The ransomware protection, they actually do document on their own site. Their documentation has come a long way since my first video, in which I kind of lambasted their documentation a little bit. They do ransomware protection using object locking, though, whereas I use bucket versioning. I did read their document. It's still actually kind of scant, so I'm not sure if it's going to be super useful, but do follow it if you feel that you don't want to deviate from what they actually recommend and use object versioning like I do. I still owe you all a video about essentially logging and verifying backups and all that sort of stuff. I will get to that at this point now that I'm kind of back in the game and working with Kopia closely again and on a regular basis. The other thing is, in the last video, I kind of wasn't super nice about the UI. It still lacks a lot of functionality. It's not super flexible, but I have come around to using it for at least my home directory backups. It runs in user space as me. And now that I have this ransomware protection, I don't really mind that there's a plain text, JSON config file with my AWS access keys just kind of sitting there 24/7. I still use a cron job or a systemd timer to back up, Etsy or Roots Home or any other locations that I have to, because you can only have a single repository and a single prefixed path in that repository in the UI at one time. So that's still a limitation and part of why I don't really love it. That being said, it's kind of nice to just be able to click around and see what your snapshots look like or anything like that. See when the last one was taken, see if there's one actively going when your system might be running slow or you're noticing something weird, whatever it may be. So in any case, I'm going to get over to my computer and I'm going to show you guys how to basically create the S3 bucket, enable versioning, create some policies that should secure things, apply them in Kopia, and take your first backup. If anyone has questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And as always, you can check out my wiki for some updated documentation, example configs, all those sorts of things. All right, everyone. So we are on to our actual implementation of KopiaUI with ransomware protection for our home directory. Now, the entire reason that what we're doing works is because of something in S3 buckets or object storage called versioning. It is beyond the scope of this video to talk at length about what object versioning is, how it all works, and everything like that. But the biggest thing is there's something that happens when we delete an object in a version bucket. And what happens is, instead of the object just going away, a delete marker is put in its place, and then the object itself becomes what's called non-current. So it's still accessible, it's just not the current version. The delete marker is now what is current. In any case, there's a Pluralsight article I will put in the video description It's a pretty good article. It's short and sweet. It's not going to take you super long to read, but it does talk about delete markers and object versioning. If you don't have a grasp on how this works and you want to know how it works, I recommend checking out this article. And frankly, if you're using object versioning as a means to protect your data from ransomware, I think you should understand it, so just bear that in mind. On that note, since my last video, Kopia has really stepped up their documentation game. They have a lot more written. They even have a whole section about ransomware protection. That being said, they don't use object versioning. They use object locking and some functionality that they've built into Kopia around that. Additionally, it seems like that decision was made primarily because of Backblaze supporting it. But in any case, I don't use the exact same mechanism for my ransomware protection that they do. I have been using mine, tested restores, all of that kind of stuff for 2 or 3 months now. I have not had any issues. I'm confident in that it's a suitable mechanism to use for ransomware protection. That being said, it does mean you have to have proper policies attached to your users in AWS or Wasabi or whatever it may be, whereas object locking may be a little bit easier to configure because it's at a bucket level. So I do understand why they may go down this path. That being said, it's not how I go about doing my ransomware protection. Again, you can choose whatever you like. If you're following my video, I'm going to show you what a proper policy looks like and why it works. On that note, this is my wiki, and I have a page specifically about Kopia. As I keep talking about things, I will fill out my wiki, but the piece about Kopia is pretty well fleshed out. I have an example policy here, and when we look at this example policy, you're going to see we have 2 different statements. Number 1, list objects in bucket. So we have S3 list bucket, and then we have our bucket name. Now, I explained this in my last video. I use one S3 bucket per system to back up. And then for every location on that system that I'm backing up, I have a separate repository in a separate, with a separate prefix in my S3 bucket. So if I were to take a look at this policy, my bucket name here would be the same, but then underneath here, I might have my bucket name / jthan home, my bucket name / root home, and my bucket name / Etsy. And each of those would be a separate repository in Kopia. Now, again, I also explained this in my last video. The UI only allows you to input a single repository with a single prefix path. So I have come around to the UI a little bit. I've taken to using it just for my home directory because it runs in user space as me. But for my other, so on this system, which if we look at my terminal here, this system is called Senna. For this system, I will have one bucket called Senna Kopia with 3 different prefixes. It'll be Senna Kopia is my bucket name, and then my repository prefix will be jthan home, root home, Etsy home. The jthan home one will be managed by the UI right here. The Etsy home and root home will be managed using cron or systemd timers. They'll run in the background. They won't interfere with the config for the UI or anything like that. The last thing I want to point out, this second statement here, allow all object actions. And the action here that is allowed is S3 star object. So if I go here, this is a list of all the actions, resources, and condition keys for S3. You can find a similar table for almost anything in AWS, and you'll see the whole list over here. This essentially shows all the different IAM permissions and the ways that they can be configured. Our policy here has star object. So if I were to look at delete object, grants permission to remove the null version of an object and insert a delete marker, which becomes the current version of the object. Sounds pretty similar to what I said before. Then we also have delete object version. Grants permission to remove a specific version of an object. However, our wildcard in the policy here, S3 star object, does not match delete object version. This is what actually grants us our ransomware protection. The keys that we're going to put into the KopiaUI in a little while are completely available in plain text on our system. If we had a piece of malware or virus or something like that that was able to pick up that file, it would have our AWS access keys. Potentially, that means somebody could delete all of the current versions of our objects in our bucket. You would look at the bucket, it would appear empty. However, they would actually just become non-current versions. And because those keys can't delete object version, they would not be able to delete old copies of our data. So this is what protects us. This is how we're utilizing this feature in S3 and S3 compatible storage, ultimately to achieve our ransomware protection. So it's a lot of talking. If there's anything I can clarify, leave a comment on the video, ask a question, whatever it may be. But we are going to actually get this set up and working now. So as I just said, for any given system, I have a single bucket. This system that we're on right now is called Senna. So we're going to select a region. I put my buckets in US West 2. It's a general purpose bucket. We are going to call this Senna Kopia. We're going to leave ACLs disabled. We're going to block all public access. We want to enable bucket versioning. This is what I just talked about. This is what actually affords us our ransomware protection. Kopia encrypts our data before we send it, but we also get at-rest encryption in S3. We're going to just choose the default server-side encryption with Amazon S3 managed keys. If you were going to try to implement the ransomware protection using object locking, that is under advanced settings here. We're not going to do that right now. As I said, we're using bucket versioning. So we're going to go ahead and create our bucket. Now, that is step one. The second thing that we have to do with our bucket is add what's called a lifecycle policy. So we're going to go ahead and click on our bucket here. We're going to click on management and we're going to click create lifecycle rule. Now, I'm going to call this delete old objects. And we'll, in this case, we're going to say apply to all objects in the bucket. If you wanted a different retention policy for my home directory versus root versus Etsy or something like that, you could use a prefix here and create separate rules. I use the same lifecycle for all of my stuff in this one bucket. So it's going to just say, hey, you're applying this to everything, just so you know. You have to check the box. And what do we actually want this lifecycle rule to do? We want to permanently delete non-current versions of objects. So since Kopia will not know about essentially these non-current objects or have any idea how to delete them, and it doesn't have permission to delete them, we basically want to make sure after we're outside of our retention period that we intend to keep, that these eventually get deleted, or our bucket would balloon forever and ever. So I keep my backups and snapshots with Kopia for 90 days, about 3 months. I'm going to set my retention or my lifecycle policy to clean up non-current versions of objects 120 days after they become non-current. So that gives me an extra month of wiggle room where AWS should not touch anything. The S3 bucket is not going to clean itself up. I'm not going to retain any number of newer versions. And so basically this means when Kopia deletes an object, we call that day 0, the object becomes non-current. 120 days later, it will then be permanently deleted in the actual bucket. So we have 90 to 120 days to recover in the event of a ransomware attack or some kind of accidental deletion. So we're going to go ahead and create this rule. Okay, so we have a bucket. Our bucket has a lifecycle rule. Life is good. What's next? Now we head over to IAM. IAM is Identity and Access Management, and essentially this is how we're actually going to create a user and make sure that it has access to our bucket, and then we're going to create keys for that user that we plug into Kopia, and ultimately, I'm going to make this just a little bigger. That's how we're going to access the bucket. So we're going to do 3 things. We're going to create a policy. The policy is going to allow access to our bucket. We're then going to create a group, and we're going to attach that policy to the group. And then we're going to create a user, and we're going to add that user to the group. Now, you could just create a user and attach the policy directly. However, if you ever wanted to create a second user or third user that had the exact same permissions, you could just create a new user, add it to the group. You don't have to worry about attaching the policy. This is much more useful when you're talking about policies that are, extremely complicated, or you have many, many policies attached to a group. But in any case, this is just a habit I've gotten into. I feel it's best practice, so I'm going to do it. So we're going to start with the policy. So again, I have a bucket. Inside the bucket, I have 3 distinct repositories in my example. JFan home, root home, Etsy. We're only going to talk about JFan home today, really, but I tell you this because when we go ahead and actually create our policy, that's going to be important. So I literally copy paste this from my Wiki page all the time because there's no reason I should have to type this out. So I just want to make sure I replace everything here. So list objects in bucket, our bucket name is Sena Kopia. We're going to go ahead and put that in down here as well. And then a repository prefix, again, we're working with JFan home today. So I am going to go ahead and put that in as my prefix. I would need 2 additional policies, one for root home and one for Etsy if I were going to be complete. But this is just for JFan home. So we go ahead, we click next. Policy name, I almost always name these kind of in a similar way. So it's the bucket name, Sena Kopia, and then this is going to be JFan home. Again, because I'm going to have 3 similar policies. I'm going to have Sena Kopia JFan home, Sena Kopia root home, Sena Kopia Etsy. Create policy. I am now going to go ahead and create my group. Sena Kopia JFan home. I am also going to attach my policy to this group. So if I search for this, I can click this box, create group, and you'll see here, it's going to take a second, but now it says permissions are defined. The last step here is to create our user, Sena Kopia JFan home. We don't need to provide user access to the console. We click next. We do want to add this user to the group because the group is what actually has a policy attached. Create user. We're going to wait for this to load. You can see there is one group. And our last step here is to click on the user, go to security credentials, and generate an access key. So I click create access key. It's going to ask what our use case is. If you click any of these, it basically just proposes alternative ways that you can access resources without access keys, right? If you click other, it doesn't bother you. We need access keys in this case for what we're doing. Access keys are not the most secure way to work with things in AWS, especially if you have IAM available. So if we were using an EC2 instance, we could use role-based access or something like that. It is best practice to rotate access keys, 60, 90, 180 days. Definitely, I would not do more than 180. You should be rotating these. So you delete them, revoke them, create a new pair. And I don't know why I'm getting that error. Let's see if with, please re-authenticate. Let me refresh. I'm still logged in. Let me just do that again. Other. Okay. So sometimes, guys, the console has weird timeouts that don't really make a lot of sense when you're role switching around, though. I'm in my sandbox account, so irrelevant. All right, so we're going to copy this access key. I have this terminal open specifically so I could copy these in. So we have the access key, we have the secret access key. Obviously, you don't want to save these anywhere. They're already going to be in plain text after we put them in our Kopia config. That's why this ransomware protection bit is so important, because they are stored on our system in plain text. They have to be so that Kopia can use them to actually access our bucket. Obvious caveats, you don't want to stream them or record them, put them in a YouTube video. I'm going to delete all this as soon as I'm done, so these will mean nothing. I don't even want to save them in a separate text file, though. So you'll see I haven't written this file over here. I've literally just pasted them here so that we can use them now. And when I click done here, it's actually going to tell you, you haven't downloaded or viewed your secret key. If you continue, you cannot retrieve it in the future. That's fine. If I ever lost this for any reason, I would literally just revoke it and create a new set, and it's not a big deal. So our last step here is to actually configure Kopia. So I'm going to click on S3. I'm going to put in the name of our bucket. Our server endpoint, I don't know why this is required. If I clicked on S3, it should at least have a default, I think, but it's just s3.amazonaws.com. Our region is US West 2. Our access key obviously comes from right here. and our secret access key as well. And now our object name prefix. This has to match what we put in our policy. So jthan home, and do not forget the slash. There are not actually folders within object storage. It's kind of just a construct, but it does make it nice when you are looking at the bucket in the console or something like that. It does display it as a folder, so it's kind of nice. We go ahead and click next. We put in our repository password. You want to use something really secure here, but something that you save in a password manager or whatever. If you ever need to recover your repository on a different machine or even on this machine or anything like that, you need to have that. For this example, I'm using something relatively short. My actual repository passwords are like 32 to 64 characters randomly generated. I save them in Vault. Advanced options, you can leave all of these the same. Again, this is a new repository, so our username and hostname can stay. If you were restoring a snapshot from an old system, let's say my username there was Jonathan and the hostname was Plunk. I have no idea. I would want to put those in, but in this case, new repository, we want to keep it as it is. We click create repository. This will take just a second. And then what we see is our UI is set up. And what that has actually done is initialized our repository in our bucket. So we now see in the Kopia bucket the jthan home repository, which just has some basic stuff. There's not actually been any files backed up yet. So our last step here is to go ahead and create a snapshot. So we're going to click create new snapshot. This is specifically for my home directory. That's why we set all this up. Snapshot retention. Now again, this has to match basically. It can't be more than my lifecycle policy. So my lifecycle policy was 120 days. I'm going to go 10 latest, 24 hourly. Whoops, this is the global policy. 24 hourly. I'm going to say 7 dailies, 4 weeklies, 3 monthlies, no annual snapshots. I don't ignore identical snapshots. That's not something I do. As far as files go, I usually ignore the well-known cache directories. As far as compression, I am going to go ahead and select Z standard. And scheduling, I want to take a snapshot every hour. And the rest of this can stay as it is. So I can go ahead and click snapshot now. This is a fresh install of Pop! OS on this system, so my home directory is not very big. You'll see it says 1.2 gigabytes. It's not even going to end up being that large with compression, most likely. And ultimately, this will now snapshot once an hour. And if I refresh over here, you'll see I'm up to 9 objects already. We're starting to actually write data of substantial size. So this is how you set up a bucket with versioning enabled, a lifecycle policy to delete your non-current objects when you're definitely done with them. You're out of your retention window that you care about. I've shown you how to generate access keys for a user. We put that user in a group so that we could reuse that group later. We generated a restrictive policy. That means our access keys that we did generate can only be used to delete current versions of objects. This will allow Kopia to do all of its normal operation. And as far as a restore goes, I'm going to cover that in a follow-up video because there are some proclivities there that are a little bit wonky. Ultimately, though, that's everything we needed. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. Like I said, I have a little bit of documentation to update in my wiki, but that's almost always up to date. There is an example of the policy here that we used today. There's also an example of the lifecycle. So ultimately, I think you all have everything you need. Thanks for watching. I hope this was useful. I hope this gives you some peace of mind and a good way to do some backups with ransomware protection. Especially if you use the KopiaUI, I think this is a really important thing to do because the config for this, including our access key and secret access key, is just hanging out in plain text in our home directory all the time as long as this UI is running. On that note, I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks a bunch.